Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all the top 10 teams. What do we need to see from them in week one? How do we need to feel good about them going into week two? What are the nuances that you need to be watching for and what likely are going to be a lot of blowouts for those top 10 teams? But let's get into all of the overreactions that are going to happen early on in this season. I can just feel it, and I want you guys to, at your best at least, avoid these as best you can. So let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and there's this big one that has been happening over the last couple of years. There are going to be teams that have a ton of portal players coming in that lose in week one. That is just going to happen. Whether it's, Colorado possibly losing tonight against North Dakota State or Miami possibly losing to Florida on Saturday. It's going to happen. There's going to be a team that comes out just a little bit clunky. Florida State in week 0, we saw it happen. It was a ton of portal players that they were trying to fit together that they just couldn't quite get together at the speed that they wanted to. Now, all of these teams had an extra week, which definitely helps, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be one of those things that is going to develop over the first couple of weeks where you see teams look a little bit clunky, look like they're just trying to get along and trying to get those wins, and then they really hit their stride. I think Miami might be the best example of this. I picked them to lose to Florida. I still think they're going to go to the playoff. I think this is a very, very good team. I just think with Cam Ward coming in with kind of the feast or famine style that he plays with and a lot of the different questions on the defensive side of the ball, I think they're going to take some time to get together. So losing week 1 to Florida would not change my opinion on Miami. It's the exact same team. It's the exact same team that I bought into early on in the season. They're just going to have to round into form. And I think that's something that we're going to have to give them a couple of weeks for. So if you're going to jump all over, maybe Oregon doesn't play quite as clean as you want against Boise State, or maybe Ole Miss looks a little bit clunky on offense throughout the first couple of weeks. Just give them a little bit of time, because at some point these guys are going to let everything click, everything's going to come together, and then it's going to be a really dangerous team. But at the end of the day, you might see just a couple of those big-time portal teams lose early on, and then maybe a lot of people kind of dunking on them or burying them or writing them off. I wouldn't do that just yet, at least. Moving on, young quarterbacks are just not going to look great in their first big game. That tends to be something that happens throughout everyone's career. Is they play that first big game in the first couple of weeks of their first starting season, and things just don't look all that great. Whether it's jitters or just not being super comfortable in the offense, what have you, there are a number of things that can jump in your way. I mean, Miller Moss and Garrett Nussmeier are about to play a big one on Sunday, and frankly, I think both those guys are likely going to be fine because of how long they've been in the system, but there's a reality where early on in that first quarter, they're sailing balls, a couple of balls are just getting away from them because of those jitters, and then they settle down and they settle in. And then the one that I'm watching, Tennessee versus NC State in Charlotte, is a very interesting one. You have Nico Iamaleava, an uber-talented young kid that I think the talent and the ability is absolutely through the roof. And then you have Grayson McCall, a sixth-year senior, very confident in pretty much any situation he's been thrown into, but is taking a step up into that Power 5 level. So it's going to be really interesting to watch this one unfold, but I wouldn't be all that surprised if Nico came out and was just a little bit flat, just didn't look all the way there, and it doesn't mean that he's not going to be all the way there in the coming weeks, because I think this kid's going to be an absolute monster this year, but there's a reality in week 2 where he goes into Charlotte and things just look a little bit clunky at times, so definitely something to watch there. And then the other guy I'm watching is Alex Orji. He plays that game in week 2 against Texas, and we talked about it a little bit, but it has that Alabama feeling to me. It has that Alabama against Texas feeling where you have a quarterback that is uber talented running the ball, that struggles to throw the ball, that you're going to have to get into the offense at some point or another throughout the season. I just think it starts a little bit slower than they want it to, and he makes a couple of mistakes in that game, and things look a little bit clunky, but he rebounds and has a great season after that. So I think he's a very capable player, but that week 2 matchup could look a little bit ugly. And then if you want to talk about another week 2 matchup, Dylan Raiola against Colorado could look a little bit clunky. That is a lot on his shoulders in a rivalry game at home with a ton of people around him that maybe things just don't look quite as crisp as you want them to look for these quarterbacks, but at the end of the day, they could be very, very good down the road. So just hold back just a little bit on these young quarterbacks going into those first big games, because there's a reality where the next big game they play, they absolutely light the world on fire. And then moving on, a veteran team is going to win a big-time game at home, and really just any team winning a big-time game at home early on in the season is going to happen. Whether you're talking about A&M against Notre Dame or you're talking about West Virginia against Penn State, there's going to be a moment where you see a team that is more talented, that is has more ability, that is higher ranked, go into a really raucous atmosphere and just fall a little bit short. It could happen in week 2 when Texas goes up to Ann Arbor. That's a real possibility where Texas just gets totally overwhelmed by that atmosphere and ends up falling in that game. And that's something that is going to be kind of hard to gauge because obviously Texas is going up there thinking that they're going to win that game. But when you talk about all of these different environments that are going to be on display this upcoming year, Wisconsin is hosting Bama in week 3. And I think that's one of those games that not only is it very far away and Bama hasn't played well on the road, but that's a really good atmosphere that is going to get after Bama in a way that I'm not sure they're fully prepared for. So I think it's one of those things that home field advantage is always huge in college football. No two ways about that. That's why some people are trying to be the 5 seed instead of the 1 seed in the playoff. But at the end of the day, if you get those big time games at home early, I think it means so much more. I think you have a real springboard for your team. So whether it's Wisconsin knocking off Bama or it's Michigan knocking off Texas or West Virginia over Penn State, it's going to happen early on, and I just want people to make sure that we fully understand just how much home field advantage means, especially in college football. And then moving on, I think new play callers coming out of the gates just a little bit clunky in their new system. And I want to talk about DeAnton Lynn here pretty quickly because he's walking into a USC defense that has tons of talent, that has tons of names. They're not there from a strength and conditioning standpoint. They're not there from a scheme standpoint. They're not there from a technical standpoint. So there's a reality where things come out just a little bit iffy against LSU, and frankly, I'd be a little bit surprised if they didn't come out a little bit iffy against that LSU offense. And then on the other side, you have Blake Baker, which is the exact same conversation. You know, you just don't want it to be downright disgusting. That's the goal. You just want it to be at least enough to make some opportunistic plays and get a win in this game. We'll talk about that game and fully break it down tomorrow. But then the other thing that I had in mind is Andy Kotelnicki at Penn State. This is a totally different offense than what they ran a couple of years ago, and it's something that they're going to have to figure out how they adapt to it, and Drew Aller's going to have to figure out how he fits into this offense. Maybe it takes a week or two. Maybe it's not as clean as you want it to be early on, and then they find their groove and really get going. But this is definitely one to watch as you get throughout these first couple of weeks. But definitely don't bury these people, because I do think there is a world where you just kind of adapt to the player in front of you, and you end up having a really, really good offense like Tommy Rees and Jalen Milroe a year ago at Alabama. So definitely going to be really interesting to watch there. The other thing I want to talk about is a higher-ranked team losing as an underdog, because this is a hard one to kind of get your head around. The whole Notre Dame against A&M game is the big conundrum in week 1. Is it an upset if Notre Dame loses, or is it an upset if A&M loses? Because A&M's favored in this game, but Notre Dame is the number 7 team in the country, A&M's the number 20. I tend to believe the line is a little bit better of a way to figure out what's an upset and what's not, but at the end of the day, anything within 4 points I don't really consider an upset anyway. I think they're all close enough to where it's pretty much a coin flip. I understand it's technically an upset, but I don't necessarily consider it that way by any means. And then there are a couple others that could happen throughout the season. I think Georgia-Bama could be an option here. I don't necessarily expect that to be the case, but it could be that, you know, Bama is the lower-ranked team, but being at home, they've played really good offense early on. They would be the favorite team possibly. And then Texas at Michigan is another one. Definitely don't expect that, honestly. I think the line is pretty much set where it's going to be unless Texas somehow loses this weekend. I expect them to be the favorite there, but there are a couple there that definitely could be really interesting, and maybe just don't bury that. Maybe Notre Dame, if they lose on Saturday, maybe just don't bury them too quickly, because that is a tough environment, and they weren't even favorites going into that game. So kind of a hard thing to gauge, but I think it's better to look at the line than the rankings if I'm being totally honest. And then finally, these elite offenses could come out just looking a little bit iffy. Defenses tend to win the opening weeks. That's just how it's been the last couple of years, and I think it's something that really just makes sense, right? These offenses are a little bit more nuanced. It's a lot about timing. It's a lot about these little intricate things. Defense is a lot of go ball, see ball, go get ball. That's kind of the reality of defense. Now, there's a lot of nuances. I'm not saying there's not, but at the end of the day, it's a little bit easier to hit the ground running on defense than offense, and that's why you see some of these real defensive battles early on in the season. I think that's likely going to be the case this year. So whether it's Texas not looking all that great against Michigan, which I wouldn't be all that surprised about against a Michigan defense that is going to be outright ridiculous, or it's Ole Miss just not looking all that efficient throughout the first couple of weeks. Now, they play some layups, so they should be able to look efficient, but at the end of the day, maybe it looks not all the way there, or maybe Miami doesn't look all the way there, or even Florida doesn't look all the way there. So it'll be interesting to watch these ones unfold, but at the end of the day, I think in college football, we love to get caught up in overreactions, especially early on in the season. There are so many different ways to say a team is terrible or say a team is incredible. But at the end of the day, finding the middle ground in the first couple of weeks at the very least, and then letting yourself around week 4, week 5, let those hot takes fly. Say so-and-so is overrated. Say this guy cannot win the big one. Whatever you want to say at that point, I'm more than on board for. But the first couple of weeks, just let teams find themselves, let teams get into a groove, and then we'll see where everything stands around week 5, week 6. But let's take our last break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the players and coaches that are under a little bit of a microscope on week 1. Just what do we need to see from these guys, and how what they do on Saturday is pretty important for the rest of the season. So we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.